The older I get, and it's I guess it's less about age and more of what's happening around us with American comic books in the mainstream setting, if you will, when it comes to Marvel and DC. And I remember when I was younger, because this was like right on his way out when I was younger, and remembering like how some people would talk about Jim Shooter, in a more unfavorable light. And the older I got, obviously, the more educated I became, and also looking at how the insane people run the asylum. I think I'm not going out on much of a limb, let's say this, by saying that Jim Shooter may be top three in terms of the most underappreciated persons in American comic book history. For those of you that aren't familiar with Jim Shooter was a guy, obviously he did DC stuff early on, but he kind of ran up there. He was a comic book guy through and through. Like I believe he was like 14, 15 years old when he stepped on a comic book scene, and he was already like selling stories and shit to like DC and Marvel, if I'm not mistaken. And he worked his way up, and he's still alive, by the way. And by the late 70s, excuse me, he ends up becoming basically the editor in chief in Marvel. And he is actually, he's not obviously single handedly. People talk about, for example, excuse me, Claremont's like X-Men and 80s like Amazing Spider-Man and all that stuff, 80s Spider-Man, excuse me, all of that, which you look at as that shit will transcend generations, and it will be what we look at to as a beacon of like Marvel comics throughout the definitely that part of the 80s, revitalized them, and people started taking them about as serious as they ever had. Largely, most of that was facilitated by way of Jim Shooter. And it was a case of insane people running the asylum. And what happened was Jim Shooter came on, and he was like some would say that he was more of a hard ass, but he was necessary now that I'm looking at it, right? And I think a lot of people are looking at it like this. Well, it was like, okay, we got deadlines to meet. You need to meet these. There's not going to be a whole lot of things that are open for interpretation there. Basically, it was like a job, right? It was like you come to write for Marvel Comics. You have to artist, writer, whatever. You expect to be within in your look. Creativity. I say this all the time. Creativity is not just being on a free for all. Creativity is operating with particular confines, and whatever rules have been set. It doesn't matter what it is that we're talking about in any creative space, and you have been able to come up with something that is genius in that regard, right? So there's always some sort of confines that you must stick behind, and it's not just a fucking free for all, right? That's not necessarily what creativity is. Creativity is just a flat out free for all. So he comes by, and he gets a lot of these people in check, and maybe the argument that some people could make. And maybe that makes the most sense. If you're saying, okay, maybe Jim Shooter he overstayed, if you will. I would disagree with that, but I could understand that argument more than anything else. But wow, looking at what he did, and I encourage you guys to actually research that. I'm not saying this guy was like a fucking perfect human being. I'm saying what he was more so how he was able to facilitate turning Marvel around it wasn't as much of a free for all. Wouldn't it be a beautiful thing if a Jim Shooter came along right now? Especially with Marvel. Because you think about it, what is the criticism that a lot of us have? Well, it isn't just, okay, they're putting out stuff that is of the social justice ilk. See, that's a misassessment. That's not just what this is. There are a lot of problems with both Marvel and DC right now. But a lot of it stems from a bunch of fucking crazy people that have no business being in positions of leadership, albeit as well. But also with writers, you fell upwards, right? You think under a Jim Shooter, someone like Kelly Thompson exists where she gets to put out, for example, something like West Coast Avengers, which was dog shit, dead on arrival. And then fails upward, gets Captain Marvel, which is dog shit, ends up getting able to. So after back to back, those were just dead on arrival for the most part. She gets to write Deadpool and Black Widow. She got awarded for putting out garbage. Clara Rowe, she's not a good artist in this perspective. Maybe in her own right, but when it comes to doing like Marvel Comics, no. She does Fearless. That was dog shit, and probably within that same time frame, she was also responsible for something like Nebula. So she fails upward. You think those people exist under a Jim Shooter? No, they don't. Now that means that, and this is why I say it, and this is why, again, also I gained more respect for the Jim Shooters of the world, and in this aspect, Jim Shooter. Looking at it after the fact and as an adult and analyzing what really happened, you have to be the bad guy sometimes, right? You have to. Especially if you are in control of the general direction that something goes. But it's a necessary thing. And this is why I said, for example, management isn't for everybody. It's not. You can be like Jim Lee, for example. Jim Lee is in a leadership position for DC Comics, doing a fucking terrible job. He's a great artist. Phenomenal artist. Incredible. As a leader, you'd either have to concede one of two things. One, he's completely complicit in what it is that he's been able to do with, or what the direction that DC's been going in. Hell, you can listen to him on DC's fandom, all this stuff. I did a video talking about Jim Lee was in on it. So he's complicit or he's inept. One or the other. Both, maybe. Maybe he's complicit and inept. Nonetheless, he has no business being in that position. But sometimes you got to be the bad guy, because the bad guy has to look someone in the eye and say, you're not good enough, or you're going in a different direction than what it is that we're doing. And yeah, they're going to call you whatever names that they're doing. They're going to make it seem that you're the worst person in the world. It comes with the territory. The product at the end of the day is going to be better off because of it. And this is why Jim Shooter was obviously necessary for his era, but even more so, we need that now. So I gained much of the older I get, and the more, I'm talking with my actual comic book buddies about, it's like, damn, man, Jim Shooter may be one of the most underappreciated people to ever exist in mainstream. Well, I would argue for sure he's one of, but how high he ranks on the list is like, it's crawling to the top, because he is just a phenomenal. He was so necessary for that decade, definitely the 80s Marvel, and a lot of the stories that none of that stuff maybe happens without him. And he rubbed some people the wrong way. I know we know he clashed with a lot of creatives, but definitely when you're comparing it to the free-for-all that a lot of it was prior to that, he had to be the bad guy. He was going to be the bad guy either way it go. Either way it went, he was going to be the bad guy. So I gained much more of an appreciation for the Jim Shooters of the world. And man, DC and Marvel could absolutely use a Jim Shooter today. You just watched a clip from my podcast, For Canon's Sake. Catch us live at 12 p.m. throughout the week over at youtube.com/YoungRipper59 and follow us over at odyssey.com/@YoungRipper59. If you want to watch the entire video cast after the show is over, just be sure to become a member on the YouTube channel. Of course, the full audio portion of the podcast is available for free on all major digital platforms, or just visit forcanonsake.com.